This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before I jump into my guest today, I have a request. I make these requests occasionally. Maybe you think it's quite often. If you like this podcast, if you want to give a little love back, go to iTunes, write a review. Let me know what you think. And if you want to take it a step further, go pick up one of my books like Trend Following or The Complete Turtle Trader. Go on to Amazon, write a review. I will appreciate your hard work and will continue to deliver great guests like my guest today, Gabriel Radvansky. He's a professor specializing in cognition, brain, and behavior. His research is focused on the development of mental model theory for human memory and cognition. Mental models, look, just a person's representation of a situation they experienced, read, or heard about. His research is aimed at understanding how people create, organize, store, and retrieve mental models. And he has some especially interesting research into the issue of walking through doors and forgetting. When you walk through a door and you forget what you were just thinking when you go into the next room. It's a touch more complicated than perhaps you've ever thought about. Let's jump right in today to my guest, Gabriel Radvansky. In advance of our call, I started thinking about architecture, which is probably not a surprising thing to say given your work. And so I started thinking about one thing in particular that's kind of close to my heart. I started thinking about Wall Street trading floors. And Wall Street trading floors for years have been these open air environments, people sitting side by side, very not closed in, not walled off. These guys got all the money in the world. They could be in their own little private offices. Why do they have to be next to each other? But going through your world, I'm starting to think to myself, have some of these folks figured your work out, maybe not scientifically, but maybe just kind of realized over the years that their productivity, hence involving their cognition, their memory, was increased when they're in these open air environments versus closed environments?
Yeah, I can see. I haven't thought about it in terms of that particular example. Clearly, when you don't have to switch from one event to another, you can hang on to some of the information. Thinking about that example, what your idea of a location is and what your idea of an event is much more fluid. You can either have the location just be you at your particular spot right there, or you can expand out to something larger. So, thinking about my office here, I can be sitting here in front of the computer, or I can be over up to the side at the table, or I could be, those be two different locations, or I can be in my office, which is one location. And that's one of the advantages of the whole event cognition approach. It's the advantage and it's a disadvantage in that the definition of what is a location, what is an event is kind of fluid, kind of slippery. That's apparently how cognition works, that we can switch between different levels pretty easily.
I'm jumping in here right off the bat with that example, but for our audience, I should probably let you take it a little bit from the top. A little inside baseball here. And what we're really talking about is this classic conundrum that we've all experienced that you've really figured out, which is, why does walking through doors just throw us for a loop? Happens to me all the time. I'll be in one room and I've got the great thought, the brilliant thought. Look, I'm a guy that writes things. I walk into the next room and I'm like, where the hell did it go?
Yeah, exactly. I think most people think about it in terms of the disadvantage. Why is that a problem? Why does that happen? Why do I forget these things when I walk through doorways? But I think of that more as an advantage, because if you think about the environment, when you go from one environment to another, you don't want to carry the stuff from the previous environment into the new environment. So what you do in a forest may be different from what you need to do when you walk into a meadow. And so you need to leave some things behind and pick up on new things. I think it comes into play in terms of the architecture of the buildings that we build, bringing up your previous point, that the reason we have different rooms and doorways separating between rooms is because we do different things in those places. And you usually want to leave behind what you're doing in one place to pick up what you're going to be doing in the new place. And that's, I think, an advantage. So that's why I think that happens.
Why don't you define event boundary? You brought it up there in the beginning, but I should probably let you define it and let people understand where you're coming from.
An event boundary is something that defines an event. For us, events have a lot of components. Events occur in some spatial temporal framework. So that means the location that you're in, so the spatial boundaries, whatever it is you're at, a room or an outdoor area or whatever it may be. And the temporal boundary is the beginning and end of some coherent sequence of actions, such as watching a movie or having a phone call or whatever it may be. So that's the container, the spatial temporal framework. Within that framework are entities, and the most important entities for us are people. But there could be other things. They could be objects or things of that nature. Each of those entities has properties. It can be something very physical, like how something looks or how something sounds, or it could be something more innate, such as some internal state or some goal or things of that nature. And the fourth component is that those entities within that spatial temporal framework have interrelations amongst one another. It could be spatial relations, it could be social relations, it could be ownership relations, any of those kind of things. And then finally, each of those spatial temporal frameworks can be joined by temporal sequences or causal sequences, where you have cause and effect. So that's kind of how we think about events. Now, an event boundary is whenever any major shift occurs in any of those elements. So most of the work that you've been thinking about, and that probably gets spend most of our time talking about, are spatial shifts, going from one region to another. So when you change that spatial temporal framework, change that setting from one place to another place, we call that a spatial boundary. Now you can have other kinds of boundaries as well. So you can have a temporal shift. You're watching a movie, and suddenly there's a big jump in time, either forwards or backwards or what have you. That would be an event boundary. Or a major character walks into a room or walks out of a room. Then that's another event boundary because you're changing the entities that are involved, things of that nature. Does that give you a better idea about what an event boundary is?
Yeah. Because I'm just getting people to grasp the idea of like, look, we instinctively have all experienced the walking through the door and forgetting. You've broken this down at a very granular level. So I just wanted people to have a framework to understand where you're coming from.
Yep, that's kind of the basics of it.
Let me let you go back in time a little bit, though, because before we start to flesh out things, I would love for you to go back in time, because this is a terribly interesting direction you've gone down. We take for granted these things, and we really don't ever get under the surface, but you've gotten under the surface. What was the moment for you where you said, oh my gosh, memory, cognition, I'm going down this path? What age were you when you started to say, this is it, I love this, this is my passion, I'm going this way? Was there some kind of moment for you that really triggered you, your passion?
Yeah, it was my first day of introductory psychology. I don't know. Something about Ben Wallace, my introductory psych teachers. It was clear to me that all the questions I'd sort of been asking in my head could be answered from that perspective. So as a cognitive psychologist, like a lot of cognitive psychologists, I come from psychology from a sort of a different angle. So my original major in college was physics, and then I went to computer science because I liked the whole AI thing, and then I got into psychology because it was really getting at the questions about what is thinking, what is the mind, how does it all work. It's a little bit different from a lot of psychologists who want to be helpers, who want to be clinicians and things like that. So it's a little bit different kind of psychology. I guess I'm the more nerdy guy in a lab coat with the rats in the maze kind of approach to things. So that's kind of how I got involved in it. My college grades were average, and after I got into this, they just sort of took off. So clearly that was an indicator to me that this is what I should be doing. And I've been doing it ever since, and everything's good.
Was there any particular, you mentioned that first class, was there anything, a particular example, something the professor said, something that sticks as color in your memory that really pushed you, or is it just the overall experience?
I think it was just the overall experience, just his first day description about what a psychologist is, what a psychologist does, sent me over the edge. I was at a sort of a loss of what to do. I'd taken the previous quarter off because I didn't feel like I was going anywhere. And this was actually in the summer, coming back to school, and everything just opened up for me. Everything just was timed perfectly. I was ready to receive that.
I would love to go back to the history of memory research and for you to perhaps lay some of that foundation for some of the early pioneers. I've read some names, but is there a particular pioneer where we can really look at, say, okay, that it really started there, and perhaps knowing that it started there and then kind of trace some of the evolution to where we are today?
Well, it all started with Hermann Ebbinghaus and the publication of his book in 1885, looking at memory. That was very early on. He basically wanted to study memory, and what he thought was the pure form by memorizing long lists of nonsense syllables, so consonant, vowel, consonant trigrams that have no meaning in the language. In his case, it was German, because he was German. From that, we derived some basic principles of memory, such as the forgetting curve, the idea that you lose information over time, and this goes in a regular way. It's proportional loss over time. That's kind of started it all. Memory from that point had fits and starts. There was what we called the behaviorist era in psychology, where you give guys running rats and mazes and things of that nature. And then memory didn't really take off as a topic of study per se in force until probably the early 1960s, where people started using the invention of the modern digital computer as an analogy for how the mind works, which makes sense because engineers were designing computers the way they thought the mind worked. We were using this device to serve as an analogy for how we think that human memory works. So we've got this long-term memory, which would be like your hard drive. We've got your working memories, what you're currently thinking about, so that should be like your RAM, and things of that nature, and looking at how the computer accesses information and using that as a guideline to look at how we access information from our own memories. The way of thinking about studying cognition and memory is, as psychologists and other cognitive scientists, we're trying to reverse engineer the mind. We're giving people information, we're seeing what comes out on the other side, and trying to figure out what's going on in between. The same way an engineer might try to reverse engineer some device that he can't actually get into to figure out how it's working and what it's doing. That's kind of where we are.
As you bring up that example with the early pioneers in computing technology, their thinking of how the mind works. Given that basic, and we can all kind of think about the basic operations of a typical computer, hard drive, RAM, etc., how closely do we think we are in terms of understanding? Because I know there's been some over the years, and I believe some thought where, okay, there's some silos here, so to speak. I'm using my own jargon, but then hold on, memory's everywhere and then it's nowhere. But then I guess some of the newer research would say, hold on, there is a regional component. Can you elaborate there to give people a better handle on what's going on?
In terms of how we represent memories?
In terms of the storage of memories, what we know about that. And you brought up the idea of the early computing and what scientists thought our minds were working like, and say, oh, this design computers like what we think our minds are operating. Were we close at all?
Yes and no. What's sort of guiding the way we think about memories is what has been called a literacy metaphor, that memories are like pages or like books that they're sort of discrete and they're there as a whole. And that's not how it works at all. I mean, our memories are very fluid, very flexible. So we're basically still at the very early stages, just trying to quantify the characteristics of memories, what their shape is and how they can alter themselves as need be, depending on the demands that the person is dealing with at the moment. Several decades ago, there was this push to shift from the computer metaphor to what they call the brain metaphor, where memories are in the connections among the neurons. And nobody really knows what pattern of connections would correspond to a given memory, or how big a memory is, how many neurons a given memory might require to represent, a trip to the beach or something like that. We're just not there yet. We're still at the level of trying to figure out what the various components of the brain do and how those are involved in the processing of information. Let me give you an example here of what I'm talking about. This builds on some of my more recent work. So I told you before about back in 1885, Ebbinghaus had this forgetting curve, which is this negatively accelerating function. So basically, the more time that's passed, the more information that's lost in a proportional sense. So, and people thought for over 100 years that it was just sort of this continuous process. The more time that's passed, the further away you get, the less you're able to access that information. And what I've been finding is that that isn't completely true. One of the things that I've found that's been particularly striking to me and to people I've been telling about is that there is this gradual loss of information that sort of levels off until about a week, about 7 days later, and then it gets worse again. So it's like there are these two phases of memory retention where people are losing information, it levels off, and then after about 7 days, it starts picking up again. So it's like this two-phase process, which most people didn't notice that because they were looking at very short-term or very long-term, and nobody really looking at something that spanned that. So that's why I don't think that was discovered. And that's interesting in terms of how information is represented in the brain and the mind, is because that sort of maps onto one of the things that we think about is going on in terms of the long-term storage of information. So the idea is that initially the hippocampus is very involved in retaining and holding on to information, but the very long-term representation of the information is going to be beyond that and sort of stored cortically more broadly. And the idea is that 7 days is when information is being held or maintained in the hippocampus, and that after that period of time, those memories become disrupted. And so what you're left with is just the cortex. And what we're seeing behaviorally is something that maps on to this neurological shift. And I think this is also something that people in their everyday experience have some sort of intuition about. So in experimental psychology, we are very clear to define what we call short-term memory as being something that lasts 30 to 60 seconds, things that you're actually thinking about. But that's not how people use that term typically in their everyday conversation. When people are saying they're having short-term memory problems, they can't remember things over the short term, they're usually talking about something that's a much longer period of time. I have some data that I actually collected last week showing that tends to map onto the 7-day shift, that most people, when they use it from short-term memory, they're talking about a few days. And if you ask them to give a number, the average of that is pretty close to 7 plus or minus 2 days at which they can remember things. So just like people have that everyday experience of walking through a doorway causes forgetting, we also have this sort of everyday intuition about the shift and the change in the nature of our long-term memories. And that's sort of getting at the representation of things. How are things being represented in different parts of the brain over different periods of time for different purposes?
I've got a great example. At least I think it's a great example. It's very personal to me. I want to share it with you just to get some feedback. I'm sure you've heard these stories many times. You just said that, we've got this intuitive feel about things. And, you said, well, the more time that's passed, we're less able to access, and that's not necessarily true. I should share with you, in the last 5 years, I've had a chance to spend most of my time in Asia. It's been an interesting experience, relationships, ups and downs, all that kind of stuff. Fantastic exposure to different things. But, over time, it starts to dull. That's one point. The second point, 10 years ago, I had a book come out, a true story about a trading story. Both of these events, the living in Asia and this trading story, both have inspired me this year to develop film scripts. And what's been amazing to me is that when, I like to say, this kind of intensity and passion hits, things from my memory that I don't know where they are coming from appear. And they weren't appearing before the project started. They really weren't like jumping out at me. I wasn't thinking about them on a daily basis. But when the words start to appear on the page and you start to fill in the blanks, it's phenomenal to me that things start to appear out of nowhere. The trading script, I hired an LA screenwriter. She comes up with a first draft, and it was based on my book. I look at it, it was great structurally, but she can't be expected to have the same level of detail that I know about the story. When I saw her script, it was like I would see a line, and all of a sudden I'd be like, oh my gosh, that line she wrote is okay, but my memory puts this instantly there, and it's 10 times better, and she agrees with me, and she's probably thinking, where did that even come from? And I'm not sure where it even came from.
That's one of the things that's really fascinating about memory. So one of the things that's frustrated me about the scientific study of memory is that it tends to focus on relatively short-term things that are hard to remember. Well, I think that comes from education. Education is basically focused on trying to learn things that are hard to remember. There's a lot of things that we learn at a high level of detail very, very quickly that are stored very, very well. And the example I always use is Netflix. So your favorite show comes on Netflix, it's released, the whole season's there, you binge watch it, and then you don't see another episode for like a year or more, right? That next season starts, you have no trouble remembering basically what's going on. You've forgotten a few details here and there, but you basically have a good grasp of what's happening and why it's happening, things of that nature. And I think that's basically how our memories are working in our everyday experiences, that we're encoding, consolidating, and storing high levels of information. So when I look at memories for things that people learn in the lab, they forget those things very quickly. Lists of words and sentences, it's gone within a few minutes or hours or days or what have you. But other things tend to hang on for long periods of time. So memories for films or books or life experiences, there's some forgetting there, but the forgetting is much, much more shallow. The rate of forgetting is much, much more gradual. That's, I think, an important thing that we really need to start looking at. And it's hard to do that because you have to wait very long periods of time to assess these things. And you're not going to get tenure if you're waiting 10 years to test somebody's memory. An important thing to keep in mind about memory, and this is very, very important. I tell this to my students the first day of class, is that memory is not about the past. We don't have memories so we can think about things that happened in the past. We have memories so that we know what to do right now and we know what to do in the future. And we draw upon our experiences of the past to help us what we're doing now and to help us doing things that we're going to be ready to be successful in the future. So when you talk about these things coming to mind that you haven't thought about in years, generally, whatever the cues are that are available to you at the moment, they're very diagnostic. And so they're picking out those memories perfectly.
That's a great example. In my situation, you're right. The writing from this other person, it was a cue that then smacked me in the head and said, boom, like that. I used two words with you. I said kind of my intuitive feel would be when things happen with me that involve a certain intensity or passion, I find my memories are spurred even more. But the better word to use really might be the emotion of it. When the emotion hits, that's when, boom, it's go time and it comes back instantly.
Yeah, our memories are, I talked about the hippocampus. Another structure that's really associated with that is the amygdala. And the amygdala is really important for processing emotional events. And those two are highly interconnected. This is why you tend to remember emotional events much better, things that have an emotional consequence for you, much better than everyday events. And so if you think about things that happened to you in your life, there's going to be the highlight reel is going to be more emotional experiences that you had. And so those emotions trigger a better encoding of memories. That's why you have things like flashbulb memories, which are these seemingly highly detailed memories for very surprising events in our lives. That doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean that you forget things over time. You don't forget things over time, because you do, but certainly those memories tend to be better. So absolutely.
I'm shocked at the situations with me because the moment it's like there's an inflection, I guess the door, walking through the door doesn't necessarily have to be a door. It's some kind of trigger that allows you to kind of shift, and then boom, it all just appears.
Right. It doesn't have to necessarily be doorways. We've also shown it with computer windows as well. So whatever defines that location, yeah.
Explain that example. That's a great, your experiment you did with that. Explain that. That's awesome.
With the computer windows? Yeah, so basically had the same thing where we had people walking through doorways to do things, but instead of going through a doorway, we had information on different computer windows, and people had to shift between those windows, and we basically had the same experience. You have also the same thing going on when people read stories. In fact, the whole walking through doorways thing didn't come from me thinking about the world and my experiences forgetting things when I walk through a doorway. It came from understanding narratives, how we comprehend stories that we read about and hear about. And there was a finding in the narrative literature that when there's an event boundary, like a character goes from one location to another, information from the prior location was less available. And so we decided, well, if this happens in the narrative world, does it happen in the real world as well? And that's why we decided to create these virtual environments where people were navigating around. And lo and behold, we found that what we're seeing in the narrative world also applies in the virtual world. And we did it in actual reality as well, in computer windows, all these different places. It shows up all the time. And this sort of resonates with my idea that the reason we have narratives is to allow us to have these vicarious autobiographical experiences, for us to experience the world in ways indirectly that has the same structure and the same memory form, same processes as actual experiences. This is why narratives are so valuable to us. You know, your life story is a narrative. Hearing about other people's stories are narratives. When you read books, when you see films, things of that nature. And the narratives that we're drawn to are the ones that allow us to have experiences that would be difficult to have in the real world, or don't really actually want to have it, but want to have the experience of it, those kinds of stories. So that's why we have the kinds of novels and films that we do, and nobody's watching stories about people in their office typing at the computer.
I would prefer some diversity past superheroes, though. Right now, we seem to have gotten stuck on superheroes. You know.
Well, yeah, they're pretty intense.
Yeah. Hey, listen. Let me kind of shift you into a big philosophical point. This is a quote from you. It's kind of random, but I'm sure it won't feel random to you. But it's a quote from you. It says, "The study of human memory is the closest one can get to a systematic study of the human soul."
Wow.
That's a big line. That's a big line.
Yeah.
I could probably keep you for hours on that one, huh? Why don't you set that up for the audience and explain that sentence, and let's see if we can kind of go down the rabbit hole with it some.
Basically, you know, who are you? You know, I think, who are you as a person? And I'm not using soul here in the theological sense. I think I'm using soul here in the sense of just understanding who you are as a person. Who you are as a person is driven a lot by your experiences. And to know who you are, you have to understand what your memories are, what experiences you've had, what kind of information are you carrying around with you. When you meet somebody, you give this story of what you've been through, and you tell stories about experiences you've had, things of that nature, to give people a feel for what your values are, where you're coming from, what your goals are, things of that nature. We also tell these stories to ourselves to understand, why am I doing this? You know, why am I going on this trip? Why am I want to buy this music? Why am I reading this book? Those kinds of things. That's kind of what I mean by that. By understanding all of the experiences that we've had, that gives us a feel for who we are as people.
Speak to the systematic study, though. The word systematic jumps out at me in that sentence.
We're really good at telling ourselves lots of stories about ourselves, and some of those stories are wrong. You know, sometimes we think that things are going on with ourselves that we're just wrong about. It doesn't work that way. In order to understand what's really going on with memory, we have to do these scientific studies where we have our experiments, dependent variable, independent variable, control variables, all those good things, so we can really be sure about what it is that's producing the kinds of behaviors that we're observing. It's due to thing X and not due to thing Y. Can we be really certain about it? So one of the examples I give in class is I ask people how they access information in their working memory, which is the stuff that they're currently thinking about. And I give these 3 different possibilities about how it might work. I ask them to raise their hand in terms of which one they think it actually is. And then I show them the data from the actual experiment where they actually assessed how this is going on, looking at response times on the order of tens of milliseconds, things of that nature, what evidence is really being used to support a particular theory. And the theory they pick is, by and large, wrong. 90 to 95% of the students get it wrong. The point of that is that even for things that involve memory very close to conscious awareness, there's a lot going on underneath that we just don't understand. We don't have conscious access to. And we have to do these systematic experiments to test various ideas about what's going on to be sure to actually understand objectively something about the nature of the human condition. What does it really mean to be human apart from our subjective experience about what we think it means to be human, which is sometimes right. I've talked about intuitions before, but sometimes is wrong. There's just a lot going on that we just don't have conscious access to. And I'm glad that, because if we did, then I wouldn't have a job.
Well, yeah, I guess at some point in time, if we figure it all out, we'll just kind of like hook our minds up to a hard drive, and we'll duplicate our minds to a hard drive, and we'll live in virtual reality forever, I guess, to some degree.
I would love that.
I don't know if you've read the book, but there's a book out by a professor named Robin Hanson called The Age of M that goes into this. As we were talking about the systematic study of the human soul and memories coming from experiences. Now, what's difficult here is that, as a scientist, you're kind of like observing, but as you start to observe, it becomes hard not to push students and to push adults further. And what I'm getting there is that the more experiences we have, the more interesting it's going to become for all of us. But if we go down this path, and I think so many people do, they kind of go down the path and say, okay, we'll do 4 years of college, and then we stop, we go into the, quote, real world, we get a job, start family, etc. And a lot of that learning and those experiences stop. And I mentioned earlier to you, ending up in Asia for 5 years completely unexpectedly. And it does something to you. It changes something. It shifts things. It's all tied together with the damn topics that you're in the middle of, excuse my bad language. From your situation, like, we really want people to say, you don't stop, keep going, don't quit.
Absolutely. And formal schooling is only one way to do this. Art Kramer has these 3 things he suggests for successful aging. That is to be active intellectually, being active socially, and be active physically. So be active in those 3 areas. That means exposing yourself to lots of different things. If you want to be a good old person in terms of having lots of memories and intellectually healthy, go lots of different places, travel lots of different places, watch lots of different kinds of movies, read lots of different kinds of books, go out and have lots of different experiences, because the more varied and the more intense your memories are in terms of the variety of experiences, the higher level of functioning you're going to be at, so that when things do start to decline, you're not going to see the deficits that you would see in somebody who isn't doing that. So you're starting at a much higher level. I think there's some research by Arthur Shimomura where he tested younger adults and older adults, and some of these older adults were college professors, and the college professors looked just like the younger adults. They didn't really show much in the way of deficits, other than maybe just being a little bit slower. You're exactly right. Do as much as you can. Have as many experiences as you can. That will be one of the best things you can do to improve your memory. People, as a memory researcher, people always ask me, what can I do to improve my memory? And there's two things I tell them. One is write things down, okay, because you're going to forget. And number two is have as many experiences, as broad of experiences as you can possibly have. Because the more you know, the easier it is to learn, the easier it is to remember. And that can be hard, that can be work, or it can be fun. It's up to you how you want to do it. So you're absolutely right on your assessment of what's going on with yourself.
I'll give one example that it's kind of hard to do, but if you just kind of start a podcast and do it for 6 years and do like 600 plus episodes and talk to like the smartest professors on the planet that are completely outside your discipline, that's a good way too.
Absolutely. Yeah, we should all do that. I mean, that's what I like about the fact that I've never actually left college. I've been here my whole life, talking with these people and having all these interesting conversations.
You just went down the path of aging. I think it's a useful direction to go in our limited time left. And that would be to help people to better understand, what is good aging and memory cognition, and what is, as family members, and we might observe a friend or another family member where something starts to change in a way that's not good. It happens to all of us at some point in time, perhaps. I want to share some of your thought process there in terms of looking for cues that maybe it's not just, someone being tired or whatever, but there's a downfall happening.
First off, successful aging is achieved by doing a lot of things I talked about in terms of being active socially, intellectually, and physically. That's going to keep you sharp. Another big component of aging successfully is attitude. So there's a lot of literature out there that I'm aware of that more you think that your memory or your cognition is going to get worse as you get older, the worse it's going to be. You're going to have trouble. Self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you tell yourself that I'm older, I'm wiser, I'm smarter, you're going to be doing better than somebody who says, I have all these senior moments and I can't remember. And you're not going to remember. That's one thing. And, even with the walking through doorways thing, when that became more widely known, I was getting a lot of emails from older adults saying, oh, thank God, I thought I was getting old. This happens to everybody. And it's true. When you're older, you forget about how much you forgot when you were younger, and you start attributing it to your age. Now, in terms of things going south, my expertise is not in dementia per se, but you tend to see a greater incidence where people have trouble knowing what the right word is, or using the incorrect word, or not being able to navigate effectively, especially in new environments, things of that nature. Their ability to segment information into events becomes more difficult. So you start seeing those kinds of problems. Now, the thing about that is that you need some pretty rigorous tests to be able to verify that that's in fact what's going on, and it's not what I mentioned before, is that maybe just getting worried about things. So that can also cause problems. There are some regularities that you do see in people's ability to remember things over the shorter period of time, over for like a minute, days, things of that nature, as well as being able to access general knowledge, like finding words that are needed at a particular moment. And that's going to be maybe an indicator of something that's going wrong.
I have used the line since the age of 19, and I still use it. People say, well, how old are you? I'll say I'm 19. And and I'm not, but it's it kind of works for attitude in terms of mindset. And I don't want to be 19 with what I knew at 19. I like being my age now and what I know now, but then just saying I'm 19. Let me throw one thing out too, and I would love for your feedback on this. I know that my ability to process, or my ability to recall memories, to recall information that I really need, dramatically decreases when I'm tired, lack of sleep.
Well, yeah, whenever there's a problem with the system, then things aren't going to work well. So if you're tired and your brain's trying to shut itself down, you're not going to be very effective at retrieving information, unless it was something you learned when you were falling asleep. Then it actually might be easier. It's kind of a counterfactual thing. It's like, consuming alcohol. I mean, if you consume alcohol and then study, you're actually going to do worse, because the alcohol is disrupting your brain's ability to do what it's supposed to do, and so you're not going to learn things very well.
Adding to that would be the students that stay up all night thinking they're going to crash study to pass your course. That's not helping them either.
That's not helping at all. I give my students all this really good advice at the beginning of the semester, and they don't listen. We have these intuitions about what works and what doesn't work in terms of our memory, and there's just things that just aren't true. If you study consistently every day, just a little bit of time every day studying whatever topic it is, by the time you get to the final, you know all that information. And if there's some sort of disruption, it's no big deal. You've learned it across time. You learned it better. So spreading learning out improves memory much better than waiting to the end and cramming. And students feel like, well, I'm working really hard when I'm cramming. And they're right. They're working hard because they're not learning anything, because we're not set up to learn things that way. It's a really debilitating and self-harming way to try to learn things. So you're trying to cram all this information in there is not very effective, and you're staying up all night, and so you're tired, and so you make mistakes on the exam. It's just really, really dumb.
I always prefer to not stay up all night and get a good night's sleep and get the F, than to stay up all night and get the F.
Yeah, if you're going to get an F, at least be well rested.
Right, exactly. That made a lot more sense to me. Hey, so as we wind down here, I got kind of a big picture question. You'll have to really kind of jog your mind and what's really your focus right now. But as we talk about these topics, are there major debates in your headspace, so to speak, with colleagues across the globe? Or is it people are generally in agreement about where we are in our understanding right now, memory, cognition, and we're kind of just keep moving down the path? Are there particular thoughts or views out there that cause you discomfort because you think someone, I'm not asking for names, but you think someone has gone a really wrong direction? I can see this in finance, for example, the efficient market hypothesis. Okay, this should not be taught still, but it's still taught. Are there areas in your space where that happens, or are people aligned and getting closer to the truth right now?
I think overall the field is getting more and more accurate ideas about how memory works. But the things that make me angry, personally, is the focus on the here and now, focus on short-term gains, and not having a big picture, which is hard to do. It really is hard to do. I think you need to be more advanced in your understanding of that. But I think the field as a whole doesn't have that. Memory research is very much an effect-driven science at this point. We just don't have enough information to have really big unified theories, which everybody would like to have, but we just don't. We're just not there yet. I get angry when people are really focused in on an effect and not trying to link things together in broader ways, and not looking at what Ebbinghaus taught us, which is that memories change over time. Usually people study something, they get tested, 10, 15 minutes later, an hour later, and then that's it. Whereas for me, I want to know how things are changing over time, because I think that can be very, very useful. One of the things that we should be able to do at this point, which we cannot do, is say how long somebody will remember something reliably. How long will a witness reliably remember what they saw? How long will a student remember something that they heard in the classroom? How long will you remember something that happened on your vacation? And we can't answer those questions. We just throw up our hands and say, well, it depends. And it's true, but it depends on what. And so this is one of the things I start pounding the table in my lab meeting, and people are grabbing their coffee cups and stuff because I'm making things bounce. It frustrates me. I understand why we are where we are, but I would like to see us expand and take this broader view of things. So, and there are some people who are doing that. So it's not like nobody is doing that, but it's just definitely not where the bulk of the work is in human memory. That's my pontification.
Well, you mentioned at the top, with not having the time to really get something done. And it kind of reminds me of something like politicians. I mean, politicians only say what they need to say to get elected. They pretend like there's this big long-term thing. I don't care whether it's left or right. They pretend it's a big long-term thing. That's baloney. They just want to get elected, and it's all short-term nonsense.
Yeah, I think they want to do some things long-term, but they generally don't have the ability. And this gets to the value of tenure. So if you want to look at very long-term things, so things I'm looking at now I'm looking at things that are months out after people learn things. If I'm trying to get tenure, that's a very poor strategy, because if it doesn't work, I'm sunk. And if you're looking for short-term gains, there's just not the time to do that. But because I have tenure, I can take that time. I can look at how things are spinning out over time, look at different angles of things, and not have to rush out, and be more certain about what it is that I'm saying and what are the implications of it. So I'm sort of in the phase of my career where I'm not trying to get as many publications as I can. I'm trying to focus more on getting publications that are going to be cited 20 years after I retire. Things that are foundational, things that are fundamental, things of that nature. And that, for some kinds of science, just takes more time and effort to do that. I understand why young scientists wouldn't necessarily want to do that because of the way the world is, but we need to be able to take that perspective and know how things fit in that larger picture. We need to look at the forest as well as the trees.
Well, from a personal standpoint, the motivation of trying to leave a legacy, at some point in time, everyone's life, that starts to feel like, hey, gosh, I want to leave something. I want to do something that's going to stand the test of time. Yeah, I get that motivation for sure.
Yeah, it's not about me. It's just I want to be able to, whatever I'm doing is worthwhile, but it's not about me.
Yeah, it's a search for the truth. I mean, it's a search for the truth. That's the only thing that really matters at the end of the day. Because, I mean, okay, if you're just searching for not the truth, I mean, no one's going to remember that at some point in time. The truth is what people remember, ultimately, hopefully.
The basic fundamental principles, yep. The
best website we can send people to check you and your world out. Is there anything you would like to promote, any beyond a website, anything you would like to push people in directions, a book or whatnot?
Probably my lab website.
You've got a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah. Just probably my lab website for what I'm doing in particular. Gosh, memory is so fascinating. Somebody who's not an expert, I would encourage them to read Daniel Schachter's books. He covers a lot of basic principles, and he has a very good writing style. I would recommend those. That'd be probably my number one.
We didn't get into it today, maybe another conversation. I find one of the things interesting, we're talking about recalling memories. I find, too, that when I can get into that, quote, flow state, that when I get into that state of mind where I forget time and place, the memories just flood back. The information you want to access just floods back, and then you stop doing what you're doing. You look at the clock or the date. Half a day has gone by. You didn't eat. You don't know what happened, but you produced this fantastic piece of work. That's a amazing feeling. I love that every time it happens to me.
Yeah, I wish I could make that happen on demand. That would be nice.
Yeah, we'll leave the audience with that one. Like, how do we make the flow state happen on demand?
Make a lot of money to figure that out.
Absolutely. But, listen, a lot of people probably really don't even have that feeling, is my guess.
Oh, I think they do. It's just so rare. Mm-hmm. It's hard to get into that.
Hey, I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for educating everyone, including myself.
Thank you, Michael, for calling me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.